All right, insulin's a key player for a diabetic. Many of you know that, either through the role it plays in your body or the supplemental insulin that you fear you may have to take one day by injection. So let's take a closer look at what insulin is about. Insulin, we've already talked about, is the hormone produced by the pancreas in response to insulin resistance. Insulin's job is very simple, simply to take or sweep the glucose out of your bloodstream. Now, a lot of people mistakenly believe that insulin's job is to reduce your blood glucose down to normal, and that isn't correct. Insulin's job is to sweep all the glucose out of your bloodstream, not down to 100 or 90, but to 0. Well, of course, if it was successful in doing that, we would slump into coma and then death long before our carbohydrates got to 0, or our glucose got to 0, rather. So there's got to be a system in the body that checks or counterbalances that effect. But I want you to understand that insulin is a very powerful hormone, estimated by most researchers to be one of the 4 or 5 most influential hormones that control everything in the body. And you can see over here in this graph some of the things that it's involved with. And inflammation, right here on top, increases inflammation. We talked about that a few minutes ago. So there's got to be another mechanism in the body to keep your blood glucose from dropping so low that we move into dangerously low levels. And that hormone is called glucagon, also produced in the pancreas. But glucagon is a hormone whose job is almost diametrically opposed of that of insulin. In other words, glucagon's job is to pull glucose back into the bloodstream in those periods where you don't have any consumption of carbohydrates, so there's no new glucose coming into the bloodstream. So since we can't drop below a certain floor in the blood level of glucose, which is normally considered to be around 55 milligrams per deciliter or thereabouts, there's got to be some mechanism that prevents glucose from dropping below that. And that's what glucagon does. You see, when we eat a meal, we have a huge amount of carbohydrate that we consume. It's converted to glucose in the bloodstream, way more than we need. So instantly, insulin springs into action, and it shuttles some of that glucose to the trillions and tens of trillions of cells in the body that need that glucose to undergo proper cellular metabolism. But it can't use all the glucose for that purpose. So then insulin takes some of that glucose and it converts it into a different form we call glycogen. It stores that largely in the liver, but some in the muscles, but mostly in the liver. We call that glycogen muscle fuel because it's readily available. Okay? And then there's still more left over. Then insulin takes that glucose and converts it into body fat. And there's our fat storage hormone. And that's kind of an interesting little sequence. People just don't understand how eating carbohydrate resulting in glucose in the bloodstream can lead to body weight, gaining weight. Well, it's a very simple process. When insulin takes the glucose, it converts that glucose into a couple different forms called glycerin and then glycerides. There's 3 of those. We call them triglycerides, and then those are stored as body fat, you see. So that's what insulin is doing. Well, then along comes a period of low blood glucose, so glucagon comes along. It takes that glycogen that the insulin stored in the liver, right here, converts it back into the glucose and dumps it into the bloodstream so that you don't fall below that floor. That's glucagon's job. We call that the sugar regulating mechanism or the glucose regulating mechanism. Okay? Carbohydrates are a very important part of this equation because carbohydrates, of the 3 major macronutrients, protein, fat, carbohydrates are primarily responsible for driving blood glucose higher. Now, granted, protein and fat can also do that in much smaller amounts in certain circumstances, but it's largely carbohydrates that drive blood glucose. And we all know the simple carbohydrates, the ones that affect us the most, the things like, sugar and very sugary products that contain sugar and high fructose corn syrup. You see high fructose corn syrup here in the tanker cars that it's shipped all over the country in. The thing that most people don't understand, most diabetics don't understand, is that the food they eat can contain carbs in foods they just had that they didn't suspect. Things like fruits. Fruits contain vast quantities of carbohydrate, and yet diabetics are told to eat fruits as part of a healthy diet. And I got to tell you, this is a terrible, terrible mistake. A normal person can eat a fair amount of fruit and their body can handle it, but not true for a diabetic. Almost any fruit in any quantity will spike your blood glucose. And that's only common sense. Look, fruits are almost 100% sugar. And we know, look, what is diabetes? Diabetes is simply the body's inability to properly metabolize blood glucose. So anything that spikes blood glucose is going to lead to all those terrible things with the inflammatory response mechanism that we talked about earlier. So we've got to keep in mind that there are foods that can really harm us if we're a diabetic. And it's not just the simple sugars, the cookies, cakes, candies, and things like that. No, the fruits, milk, and especially grains, corn, 82% carbohydrate. You eat anything made of corn, it will dump vast quantities of carbohydrate into your diet. And here's another common misconception that I want people to understand. Number one, as we saw in the last slide, people think that they get fat by eating fat. Well, while that's a contributing factor, that's not the primary reason. The primary reason people add weight is because their bodies are converting tremendous excess amounts of glucose into body fat through that conversion we talked about, the glycerin, glyceride, triglycerides, and so on. Likewise, people have another misconception about what carbohydrates do in our body. They think that high dietary carbohydrates has no effect on their blood cholesterol. But it does. Most people believe that high blood cholesterol is caused by high dietary intake of fats and cholesterol. And that is simply not correct. In much the same way that body fat is normally caused by an excess consumption of carbohydrate, high blood cholesterol is also caused primarily by a high consumption of dietary carbohydrates. Right here's the chemical sequence of what happens in the body. Glucose is right up here in this graph, a couple of steps missing here, but then it converted to acetyl-CoA, down through a few more steps, and finally it reaches cholesterol down here. And you're saying to yourself, what? Are you kidding me? So if you're concerned about elevated cholesterol, and you really shouldn't be that much, we'll talk about that in a minute, but if you think that's a concern, and you think you need to eat a low-fat diet, just like we've been told for the last 40 years, to help keep your cholesterol low, well, that's another one of those myths. Because most of the cholesterol in your body is not manufactured out of dietary cholesterol. It's manufactured out of dietary carbohydrate. For those of you who are curious to know what this full conversion sequence is here, I've laid it out right here so that you can follow it along. You can find this on Google, find it most anywhere. One last thing, the saturated fat myth. Saturated fat myth, and we talked about it a little bit here. We've been told to eat a diet in low fat, low cholesterol, and that will lead to better health. Well, let's just take a look at that. I mean, we've got to understand what these carbohydrates do because it's killing us. And I'll prove it. USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, statistics. Since the 1960s, Americans' intake of saturated fat has decreased some 22%. People have been told to eat a low-fat diet, and people have been doing exactly that. A 22% reduction. That's a huge shift. Well, there was a result of this action. And between those same years, roughly, we saw a 40% decline in hypertension, or high blood pressure. Well, this is a good thing. Can we also say that consuming a low-fat diet has also led to higher health and a longer lifespan, or more health in general? Well, we've got a problem, because we can't say that a lower-fat diet has led to any kind of increased health. In fact, over the same years, roughly 1979 to 2003, heart disease in the United States increased by 47%. We should have expected a decline of 22 to 40% or somewhere in there. But instead, we saw an increase of 47%. What's going on? And it gets worse. This heart disease increased 47% while we're eating this healthy low-fat diet, And all the while, over the same time frame, the rate of smoking dropped 24%, which is the primary cause of heart disease, which, if this gets lower, that being the major cause of heart disease, that should have caused heart disease to drop. And instead, it increased by 47%. Gee, what's wrong with this picture? You can look at some of these charts over here. When you're told to eat a low-fat diet, by definition, you've got to consume more of the other two macronutrients, the proteins and the fats. And this chart shows us that's exactly what happened. From 71 to 74 through 1999 and 2000, we see the consumption of fat in the typical American diet begins to decrease. And you see a pretty good decrease over time. Protein remains about constant. And here's carbohydrate. Look what's happened. As people quit eating fat, they start loading up more on the carbohydrate. Another interesting chart right down here. This is the comparison in heart disease rates in men in between 15 different countries compared to their cholesterol levels, the blood cholesterol levels. This is the cholesterol level right here, this dark line. And you can see the countries in this side of the chart have very low cholesterol levels, and the countries in this side of the chart have very high cholesterol levels. This dotted line is the death rate. Heart disease. And you can see over here in the countries with the lowest cholesterol rates have the highest heart disease and death rates. And the higher that cholesterol gets, generally, the healthier we are from a heart disease and death statistics. Something's real wrong here. People have cut back on the fat in their diets like they've been told. They're eating more carbohydrates as a consequence, much of it processed. Blood pressure's come down, that's sure, that's true. But we're not healthier, not by a long shot. Heart disease, asthma, arthritis, diabetes, they're all at near epidemic rates. Something isn't right. Let's look now at what I call the closing arguments. Just like an attorney before a jury, we've presented the case, you've got the facts. Now let me just start tying this thing up in your mind before we get into the specifics of what we can really do. So, how healthy are societies, different societies in the world that aren't affected by Western lifestyles at all? In other words, how is it supposed to be from a nutritional and health standpoint? Well, there have been many native cultures around the world studied over the last 100 years. One of those that was studied was the Trobriand Islanders. You see a picture of them here. This is a South Pacific island culture, and they've been studied extensively. What was found is that they had not just a lower incidence of cancer among their population or lower rates of diabetes or heart disease. No, it was astounding. There was no cancer, no diabetes, no heart disease, no arthritis, none of the ailments that are killing everyone in the Western world. They simply didn't exist. How in the world is that possible? I want you to keep that thought in your mind. Here you have one people that lives this way, and they're dying at record rates of all of these disorders. And over here you've got another culture. They live totally differently, and their life, their health, their lifespan is off the charts. Keep that in mind. The Trobriand Island people lead a very active lifestyle. Everything's done manually. And they eat, most importantly, they eat a primitive or Paleolithic diet. What is that? Well, Paleolithic diet simply means they eat a lot of lean meat, fish, vegetables, and a smaller amount of fruits, eggs, and nuts. There have been many of these kinds of populations studied over the years. Here's another one, the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands, you see where they are here. So, north and east of Australia, out in the middle of nowhere here, basically. And this is another population. They were one of the slimmest, healthiest people on the face of the planet some 65 years ago. But then something happened. You can see it here. The U.S. government decided that the Marshall Islands was a good place to do a whole series of nuclear testing. And in the decade of the 40s, they conducted 67 nuclear tests, destroyed their habitat, their fishing grounds,